Hi, my name is Jay McCurdy. I'm the State Turfgrass Extension Specialist at Mississippi State University. I want to give you an update about our annual Bluegrass project here at Mississippi State University, as well as introduce you to some of the field research that has been ongoing for the last 6 months, since last fall. I first want to talk about some of the Resist POA project that we've been conducting. One of the major goals of this project is to do a nationwide survey of potentially resistant populations of annual bluegrass. We've done that by going out to around 160 sites in the state of Mississippi. We take those screened populations into the greenhouse and we actually spray a labeled rate of herbicide over the top of a flat of about 30 of those. That is a really good way of determining whether or not we have putative resistance. The populations I'm showing here in this presentation are just simply that. They're flats which have about 30 different tillers planted. And you can see in the top row there are a number of different plants that are unaffected, particularly those that are of Princep, curb treatment, or on the lower level you can see monument resistant. These are putative tests to tell us whether or not we think we may have resistance at some of these sites. We've tested these populations from around the state of Mississippi. Again, over 160 sites, 168 to be precise. It's taken us 2 years to do this. I've been working alongside a young man, a postdoc named Dr. Eddie Carlos de Castro. 54 of those sites surveyed had at least one site of action that they were resistant to. 20 had 2 sites of action, and actually we had 4 that were resistant to 3 sites of action. 30 of our populations were resistant to prodiamine, the active ingredient in the pre-emergence herbicide Barricade. 25 were resistant to simazine. Simazine, of course, is one of those herbicides that has long been used as a pre-emergence in the fall, but also as a post-emergence herbicide in the spring. It is a PS2 inhibiting herbicide, similar to the active ingredient atrazine. They both affect that photosystem 2 apparatus within the plant and prevent that plant from usually maturing into a full-size plant. 12 of our populations were resistant to pronomide, which is the active ingredient in curb. I want to drive home an important point, which is I think that these populations are resistant to post-emergence treatment of pronomide or curb, but they perhaps are not resistant to pre-emergence treatment with pronomide, which really drives home the point. If we are applying curb, we need to be doing that at a time point when those plants have not yet germinated in the fall. Ideally, having multiple applications, maybe 2-3 applications that are overlapping in their window of control for both pre as well as early post-emergence treatment. In the state of Mississippi, that would typically be an application window sometime starting in mid-October, and then we'd have a follow-up treatment 3 to 4 weeks later, and we'd want to reapply that perhaps as many as 3 times. Again, follow the labeled rate. That's a very important critical tool in the battle against resistance. We had 9 populations that were resistant to ALS inhibitors. Trifloxysulfuron or Monument was the herbicide that we used in our first screens. We decided as a whole group of 16 different universities to use 4-M-sulfuron or Revolver in our second screening year. And again, I think these are cross-resistant. If you're resistant to Monument, you're resistant to Revolver. And we had 1 population that was resistant to glyphosate. Now, all of these populations are just a subset of the number of populations total that are in the state. Please keep up to date with us at our Resist POA project by looking at our website, resistpoa.org. That website has up-to-date information. It also has a tools drop-down that allows you to search for available literature based upon cool season or warm season scenario, and even based upon which state you're in. You can also search that database based upon cultural, biological, and chemical means of annual bluegrass control. Also, please take a look at our herbicide classification chart, which is hosted on that website. This chart allows you to mitigate the potential for herbicide resistance by including multiple sites of action within your next spray application intended to control annual bluegrass. This is a great tool, and I encourage you to use it. We'll be passing these out via distributors as well as upcoming extension events throughout the nation by any of our colleagues within the Resist POA program. Also, if you particularly need one or perhaps need a dozen or so, please send us an email to that resistpoa@gmail.com through the Contact Us tab on resistpoa.org. We've done some other pre-emergence treatments that I think have some novel ideas, and I want to share those with you. In November of this past year, 2019, we put out a demo trial looking at pre-emergence and post-emergence combinations, as well as some multiple application treatments. We had an initial application November 25th and a follow-up application December 20th. This application was made at 40 gallons per acre at Lion Hills Golf Club in Columbus, Mississippi. Now, Lion Hills is known for having resistance to simazine and post-emergence resistance to curb or pronamide. They also have putative resistance to barricade, which is information that's still forthcoming as we do more research on that. In this trial, we had a follow-up treatment applied December 20th. So again, about a month interval between applications, which is a pretty common theme if you're just asking Jay McCurdy, how far between our reapplication dates do we need? And typically that second pre-emergence herbicide is going to have a post-emergence herbicide applied with it, which is a really important point of what I want to try to show here with this trial. We actually sprayed this on November 25th. You can see in my chart here that any treatment with that blue line beside it on the right of that treatment name, that was a treatment that was made November 25th. We only had one treatment that was applied December 20th. Those applications were a non-treated, a spectacle application at 6 ounces, a spectacle application at 6 ounces in combination with Tribute Total and Princep. That application that was made twice was 3 ounces of spectacle in combination with Tribute Total and Princep. And then we had spectacle at 4.5 ounces with Tribute and Princep, spectacle at 6 ounces with Revolver and Princep, as well as Barricade, Monument, and Princep, which is a pretty good standalone in most of our other trials. We had spectacle at 6 ounces applied with Tribute and Syncor at 2 ounces, or Tribute and Syncor at 4 ounces, or Tribute and Syncor at 6 ounces, trying to look for turfgrass phytotoxicity as well as increases in control. We also had the pre-emergence herbicide Ronstar applied with Tribute Total and Princep, or just Ronstar alone. And you can think of that Ronstar alone treatment as a treated check, because if we were applying November 25th in Columbus, Mississippi, we would expect Poa annua to have already germinated. So that treatment would usually not have much activity that late in the year. It is typically a very good standalone treatment on approaches and tees when applied prior to germination of annual bluegrass. So what we see in general looking at these trends is that double up application of spectacle, even though it was 3 ounces, which is a rather low rate, applied in combination with the ALS inhibitor Tribute Total and the PS2 inhibitor Simazine, was a fairly high achieving treatment. That got us 96% control of annual bluegrass, and this was actually evaluated in February of 2020. I will say, not any one of these herbicides or herbicide combinations or treatment timings achieved 100% control, which is a real argument for what I'm going to show you in the field concerning post-emergence follow-up treatments to try to control any kind of escaped annual bluegrass before it goes to seed and propagates next year, potentially leading to more resistant populations later on down the road. I want to drive home some other points here, and that is that still Barricade, Monument, and Princep is a fairly good and effective treatment, particularly when you're comparing it by looking at those statistical nomenclature that's provided. Those letters are actually mean separations. So if they share the same letter, an A for instance, then they are statistically similar. Numerically speaking, looking at these treatments, we can't tell a lot of difference, but we can say that there are some standout treatments, particularly that treatment applied twice or spectacle at 6 ounces applied in combination with Revolver. Keep in mind, this is a site that has resistance to Barricade, resistance to Simazine, therefore, or ergo, resistance to metribuzin, and it also has resistance to curb. Curb's not in this treatment, but I can assure you curb does not control this particular population. This is what that treatment looked like in February when evaluated. This is the double-up application of spectacle at 3 ounces with Princep and Tribute Total. A rather clean plot compared to some of the plots around it. We've also looked at some treatments that I'm going to show you in the field. One in particular that is of interest right now is the use of glufosinate, looking at applications of things like Finale or Cheetah. Those are really useful tools, as well as, which I'm going to show you in the field, as well as Roundup or glyphosate applications, particularly in combination with spring pre-emergence treatments. So as we start to plan our programmatic approach for next year, we're really going to want to key in on our fall applications having pre-emergence herbicides applied most likely twice, perhaps at split or applications that allow us to stay within the yearly maximum rate of pre-emergence herbicide, in combination with at least one other mode of action. And I am asking for at least two in most instances. I'd like to see simazine in the tank if it can be, and I'd like to see an ALS inhibitor in the tank if it can be. Obviously, there are some treatments with Curb, particularly on greens, where we're looking at Curb in combination with Katana, which is an ALS inhibitor. Likewise, you could look at Curb in combination with any number of ALS inhibitors with multiple applications spaced out over a period of time. So those applications would be spaced out over a number of months. Practitioners in the industry often control this difficult to control weed two different distinct ways. One of those is a pre-emergence herbicide. Pre-emergence herbicides are laid down prior to the germination of a seed, particularly annual bluegrass, which germinates in the fall somewhere around 70 degrees soil temperature. One of the critical components of any successful program, though, is going to be a post-emergence strategy as well. Usually these post-emergent strategies are not to be relied upon solely. We do want to build the foundations of any program on a pre-emergence herbicide. One of the key components of controlling annual bluegrass is having a pre followed by a post-emergence type of approach. What I'm going to show you first are some of our research plots concerning spring post-emergence treatments that are applied in combination with a pre-emergence crabgrass treatment. So note that that pre-emergence treatment that's being applied in this case in February is not going to give any preventative control of annual bluegrass, at least not any appreciable control. The post-emergence treatment applied with it would be intended to post-emergently control annual bluegrass as well as any broadleaf or grassy weeds that happen to be present at the time of application. A good example of a treatment that is a post-emergence herbicide is something like glufosinate or glyphosate. That's the active ingredient glufosinate, which is in Finale or Cheetah, and then glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, as well as a number of other different non-selective herbicides. These non-selective herbicides tend to control grasses and broadleaves fairly well, but typically they're doing that in a fashion that is applied so that the Bermuda grass, zoysia grass are not green during the time of application. What I want to show you first is a really good example of, I think, a creative use of a non-selective treatment. This is Finale, applied at a 5 quart per acre rate. That rate is achieving quite a bit of post-emergence activity. Keep in mind, this treatment was applied in February when Bermuda grass was still dormant. The kinds of weeds that you're controlling with just a simple non-selective treatment are going to be things like annual bluegrass. It's also going to include little barley, some of the broadleaves that are present. One of I think the advantages to a glufosinate treatment that we've seen here, as well as a number of other researchers have seen, is that it tends to have a little bit more safety on Bermuda grass if it's just peeking that green tissue out and it's in early green up phase. Another very typical treatment that you see here in the southeast, particularly in the transition zone, is the non-selective Roundup or glyphosate. This is a glyphosate application of 24 fluid ounces of a 4.5 pound per gallon product. This is a typical kind of treatment. One of the disadvantages of Roundup at any time is that it can be quite punishing to Bermuda grass. That said, in this trial, the plot I just showed you of Finale, as well as this plot here of Roundup applied, had some of the same safety and some of the same green up that we'd see otherwise in non-treated plots. The advantage is that we do get some non-selective control of annual bluegrass as well as some of those broadleaves. But this is, again, this is not a very wholesome, well-rounded approach to controlling annual bluegrass without a pre-emergence treatment applied in the fall. Another disadvantage of solely relying upon non-selectives in the spring without applying any kind of pre-emergence herbicide for crabgrass or goosegrass is that you get exactly what you see here. On my left is a finale treatment. This is a treatment I've introduced already. This treatment is controlling annual bluegrass fairly well, something like 90 to 95% control. On my right is a Roundup or a glyphosate application at 24 fluid ounces of a 4.5 pound per gallon product. And what you see in both of these plots is breakthrough of crabgrass. So there are some disadvantages to using non-selective treatments for the control of annual bluegrass without applying some kind of crabgrass and goosegrass pre-emergence treatment along with that. I'll show you some of those examples here in just a minute. One of the new kids on the block is a product called Coastal. Coastal is the combination of the active ingredient prodiamine, the same active ingredient that's in Barricade, along with the active ingredients simazine of Princep fame, as well as imazaquin. Imazaquin comes to us from the active or the product Image. The active imazaquin has some post-emergent sedge activity, some, well, very little post-emergence crabgrass activity, but enough to note, as well as fairly good control of some difficult to control broadleaves. I think about things in combination with simazine that it's controlling, such as dollarweed and dichondra, fairly well. This is an application of Coastal alone applied, and you can see that we only got around 60 or 70% control of annual bluegrass, but it's of note that in combination with another selective or non-selective, this would be a fairly effective spring application that would give us post-activity on Poa annua, or annual bluegrass, and pre-activity on crabgrass and some of the weeds that are slowly sticking their heads up after the crabgrass germination has occurred. Another well-performing treatment here at Mississippi State has always been the application of Barricade in combination with simazine and Monument. Simazine and Monument both give us appreciable amounts of post-emergence control of our annual bluegrass population here on campus. This population has low-level resistance to simazine. It probably has some low-level resistance to ALS inhibitors, but nonetheless we get fairly good activity. In combination with Barricade, you get the kind of control you see here, which is preventing crabgrass and many of the other troublesome weeds that are soon to come after we've controlled the upper canopy of annual bluegrass. Fairly common old school treatment here in Mississippi, as well as most of the Southeast, has been Barricade or prodiamine in combination with Roundup. This is a pound active Roundup and applied with 24 fluid ounces of Barricade 4L. The kinds of control you see here, it's really representative of what you see because you have that non-selective control, and then we're preventing any of the crabgrass from emerging. Another very viable treatment is the combination of Finale with Spectacle. So this is a 6 fluid ounce rate of Spectacle applied in combination with Finale. The Finale rate that you choose to use can vary widely depending upon product. Keep in mind that there's the old formulation of Finale as well as the new Cheetah product, which has close to double amount of active ingredient per gallon. So you do need to make sure you abide by that label. Some of the complications of using high rates of Finale are you do ding that Bermuda grass and sometimes have issues with green up. So combination treatments of pre and post-active herbicides really are the way to go for spring cleanup, as well as the control, preventative control of crabgrass and other grassy weeds that are soon to rear their ugly heads. We've been looking at synthetic herbicide alternatives for annual bluegrass control for a little over 2 months now. We're doing this work in conjunction with work being done by Sean Askew at Virginia Tech, by John Kaminsky at Penn State, and Brian Unruh at the University of Florida, where we're actually looking at some rather common off-the-shelf non-synthetic options. You look at some of these and they're petroleum distillates or they're some kind of fermentation byproduct. What I want to drive home is that we do see some of these products being fairly effective early on. This is 7-day after treatment data that I'm presenting. The 14-day after treatment data looks fairly similar, but across 2 different sites here at Mississippi State, we've seen products like Axe and high rates of vinegar do quite well at controlling annual bluegrass. There's some reason to believe that multiple applications of some of these products could have some lasting effect to control annual bluegrass and suppress seed production. Final Sand, Scythe, these are both products that in addition to the green gobbler vinegar product and the Axe product, do quite well at controlling annual bluegrass. Look for more of these educational tutorials and vignettes from the Mississippi State University Turf Team. I appreciate your comments and feedback. We appreciate your support of the Mississippi Turfgrass program. Please stay safe and keep up the good work.